What I want to do for you today is to show you what the McPherson housing study shows, what we found in that data report, so that you get a little bit better idea of the circumstances in your community when it comes to housing. Because again, if the governor is going to make this an important issue and going to suggest legislation, and your representatives at the state level are going to be talking about voting on issues, I think it's important that you as a community understand where you're at, what your needs are, and have a voice for saying this is what we need. And so this is called the 2013 McPherson Housing Data Report. These reports are taking all of the census data that's related to housing for McPherson, compiling that, putting it in a reference guide format so you can see the primary data that's provided by the Census Bureau, and then analyzing that data and providing that analysis to help create insights. So when we look at McPherson, first of all, we'll look at population. There's been a declining in population since 2000, which is not unusual. It's pretty typical. We actually see since 2010 a kind of a turn back, an upturn. These pie charts here show in blue the percentage of housing that are owner-occupied, and the red is the percentages that's renter-occupied housing. So for the U.S. and Kansas, really what you look at is a distribution of about 2/3 owner-occupied housing and 1/3 rental housing. When we look at McPherson, we've got about 74% owner-occupied and 26% rental, which may be an indicator that you're undersupplied when it comes to rental housing, but you can't draw any conclusions just from one data point. So we'll keep that in mind, but we'll look at some other things. So the next thing is occupied housing units. So when you look at every single type of dwelling unit in a community, whether it's houses, whether it's mobile homes, whether it's rental properties, what is the occupied number of housing units? Well, it looks like things are pretty strong here in McPherson. You can see that occupancy rates here in the McPherson community are not only above the national average, but they're above the state average as well. But it looks like it's converging towards that state average here most recently. We also look at homeowner vacancy rates. So this is really the vacancy rates just in owner-occupied homes. And you see here that this is pretty low. I don't know if you can see those numbers okay, but this is 3% and this is 0%. So in around 2009, it was down around 0.5%. It's gone up a little bit, but it's still below the national and state average. When we look at the median home value, your community has pretty strong median home value. So all good news for the home values for the market around here. Rentals as a percentage of housing supply. This is the timeline view of those pie charts at the beginning. So the pie charts at the beginning are a snapshot of the most recent data. This takes it back to 2009 and looks at, it looks like, there was a higher percentage of rental properties that's gone down now. And we'll talk here in a minute about the reliability of this data, but if this is right, then it would seem like the percentage of the rentals of housing class has been falling, which would indicate either a growth in houses and not a growth in rental properties, or some things coming offline due to age and condition. So we can't really draw a conclusion in one of these, but I'll talk about what they ultimately mean when we get to the end here. Median rent rate, good news. Again, the red line's local, yellow's state, blue is the national average, and you see that the red isn't too far off the state number, which is higher than a typical community this size, so it shows strong rent rates. Rental vacancy rate. Okay, now this is a little confusing. We've seen the pie charts that seem to say you have an undersupply of rental housing. We see strong rent rates, but then all of a sudden, looking at rental vacancy rate, McPherson's up here above the state and national averages, and it seems to be climbing up and almost reaching 14%. So the question is, what's going on with that? Well, one of the things you have to keep in context with the census data is that the census does their compiling of data every 10 years, and they use software to do statistical analyses between those 10-year periods. And they know that those aren't completely reliable, so they've got what's called a margin of error. And so if you look at the rental vacancy rate, which is shown at 13.2% with the most recent data, it's got a 6.2% margin of error. So that number could actually be as low as 7%. That number could be as high as 19%. So margin of error is an issue. And it's a big issue, because like I said, this shows that it could be as low as 7% and as high as 19%. Well, that's really critical, because if you look at the averages over the last 25 years for housing in similar communities, and this is all the data sets that show vacancy rates for all different kinds of communities across the United States. This is the entire U.S. There's a bunch of others here. And what I did is the two yellow ones highlighted in yellow are most comparable to McPherson. So that says that the typical stabilized rate in a community levels out at about 9.1% vacancy rate. So if you're looking at a situation where you don't know if you've got a 7% vacancy or 19% vacancy, that's a big deal. Because if it's 7%, it says you're undersupplied. If it's 13 or 19%, it says you're oversupplied. So that's an issue. It's an issue that needs to be addressed. And so one of the things that we need to look at is how can we create more reliable data for your market so that people can really get a better informed picture of what your circumstance is